The world is committed to net zero by 2050. This will demand the biggest transformation in the global economy since the Industrial Revolution. Australian energy can power it. We know that the global energy transformation presents a golden opportunity for Australia.
Labor's renewable-only policy is the reason your power bills continue to skyrocket. We can't rely on weather-dependent energy alone. We hold the largest deposits of uranium on the planet. Making Australia a nuclear-powered nation is right for our country and will secure a future of cheaper, consistent and cleaner electricity.
I'm an environmental scientist and I'm an emeritus professor at Griffith University in Queensland.
Ian, we met, I don't know if you remember, we did a human sign outside of Old Parliament House in about 2008, I think.
Yep.
An event that you spoke at, and thanks for your assistance with that. Ian, nuclear energy is a big subject right now. Peter Dutton has made it a big policy issue, declaring that Australia needs to look at nuclear energy and it's zero emissions energy. Australia's crazy not to invest in it. It seems to be a real policy direction. Can I just start off, Ian? How important is it for Australia to reduce emissions? Can we be part of a global solution here?
Well, we need to, because climate change is a global issue, and all the studies show that Australia is affected more than most countries by the sort of climate change that's happening, not just increased temperature, more frequent extremes, longer and worse bushfire seasons, more significant flood events and so on. So we have a real interest in there being a global solution, and we can't expect other countries to do the heavy lifting if we are not prepared to do some ourselves. And in fact, I've argued that we're in a better position than most countries to reduce emissions because we haven't done the easy, cost-effective things that many other countries did after the 1970s oil crisis. To quantify that, there was a report given to the Howard government 20 years ago called the National Framework for Energy Efficiency that calculated that we could reduce our emissions by about 30% using cost-effective existing technology that pays for itself in less than 4 years. Basically, we have very sloppy appliance efficiency standards. We're only finally now getting round to having vehicle efficiency standards, which most of the civilized world adopted 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. And so there are great opportunities for us to cost effectively reduce our emissions. If, for example, your refrigerator only uses half as much electricity, not only does it do less environmental damage, it does less damage to your wallet.
Yeah.
And their criterion was a payback time of 4 years. All of the investments that would reduce our emissions by 30% pay for themselves in less than 4 years. In other words, they are economically rational as well as being environmentally responsible. So we should be setting quite aggressive targets to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, not just because it's a responsible thing to do, but because it makes economic sense.
Yep. So at the moment, particularly under a Labor government, there's a big push with renewable energy. We've got a net zero emission target by 2050. Can we do it with energy efficiency and renewable energy?
The short answer is yes. And in fact, there are quite respectable studies that show that we could meet all of our electricity needs with renewables and storage within 10 years if we were serious about it. At the moment, we're still rather half-hearted, but and to take storage, for example, the Wetherell government in South Australia was criticised by the coalition government at the national level for wasting money on a big battery. But when the Wetherell government was replaced by the Marshall Liberal government, they could read joined up writing and do takeaway sums, and they invested in an even bigger battery because they realised that the big battery paid for itself in a few months. That if you're trying to make best use of renewables, you need storage. And the former Liberal government in New South Wales called commercial tenders for 8 pumped hydro storage systems as part of their plan to be getting 85% of their electricity from renewables by 2030. So it can be done. It just requires political will.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Peter Dutton referred to renewable energy in his budget reply a couple of times, calling it weather dependent and intermittent as a power source. Have we solved the problem of intermittency when it comes to renewable energy?
Well, there's two issues here. One is that it is, of course, true that the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. If you're going to use renewable energy, you do need storage. One advantage we have, though, is that we now have an interconnected grid which stretches from Ceduna in the southwest to beyond Cairns in the northeast. And the wind can be blowing in South Australia when it isn't in Queensland, or there can be sunlight in Queensland when there isn't in South Australia. In other words, having an interconnected grid means you can shift power from where it's being generated to where it's needed. But there is no doubt to make effective use of renewables, you need more storage than we have. And we also need stronger interconnections. For example, there's serious talk about strengthening the connection between New South Wales and South Australia because South Australia, a lot of the time, is producing more solar energy than it can use, and it would be sensible to be exporting that to New South Wales rather than burning coal in New South Wales.
Mm-hmm. If we assume that renewable energy wasn't up to the task and we were dependent on nuclear energy for reducing emissions, how long would it take for Australia to transition away from coal-fired electricity to nuclear energy, and how many reactors would be required, and any idea of what sort of cost would be involved with that?
The short answer is that there have been various studies done, including the one funded by the Howard government and chaired by Dr. Sugi Zukowski, who was at the time head of the Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation and a rusted-on nuclear enthusiast. They said that it would take at least 10 years and more probably 15 to build one nuclear reactor, which would produce about 10% of our electricity needs. So I think it would be a very generous critic who thought that we could, by 2050, build enough nuclear power to meet all our needs. Mm-hmm. Because we don't have an established nuclear industry. We have a small research reactor at Lucas Heights, but a commercial scale reactor is somewhere between 10 and 40 times the size of the reactor at Lucas Heights. So it's a totally different project. Mm-hmm. If you look at what's happening around the world, 10 years ago, nuclear power was cheaper than solar or wind. But if you look at last year's figures around the world, the average price of electricity from new solar farms was 3.7 cents a kilowatt hour, and from large wind turbines was 4.1 cents a kilowatt hour, and from nuclear was 16 cents a kilowatt hour. So you're not talking about a small difference. You're talking about a factor of 3 or 4.
Wow.
So that even with storage, solar and wind are much cheaper than nuclear. And that's reflected in the pattern of investment around the world. And last year there was something like 260 gigawatts of new renewables commissioned, and a net something like 3 gigawatts of nuclear. I think there was 8 gigawatts of new nuclear and 5 gigawatts of old nuclear decommissioned. Mm-hmm. So the world is investing very heavily in renewables because that makes economic sense. I also want to talk about this notion of zero emissions. And the fundamental point is that no technology is zero emissions because it requires energy to build a nuclear power station. And for that matter, if we're being honest about it, it takes energy to produce solar panels or wind turbines.
Yep.
The question is, how long does it take to recover the energy you put into it? And all of solar and wind, and for that matter nuclear, are low emissions technologies compared with burning coal or burning gas.
Yep.
But it's nonsense to say nuclear is zero emissions. I saw Ted O'Brien, the opposition spokesman on energy, talking about zero emissions nuclear, and I went and revisited the calculations that were done by the Energy Research Group at the UK Open University when I was part of it 50 years ago. And we worked out that the carbon dioxide emissions associated with building a 1,000 megawatt nuclear power station, which is a sort of bog standard average large nuclear power station, is about 30 million tonnes of carbon dioxide. Now, to put it in perspective, Australia's total emissions is about 400 million tonnes.
Yeah.
So the emissions associated with building one nuclear power station, which would produce about 10% of the electricity we use, is about 10% of our annual emissions. Now, if it took 10 or 15 years, that would mean that the annual increase in our emissions was only 1 or 2%. But it's not trivial, and it's dishonest to talk about zero emissions for nuclear. In fact, building enough nuclear power to meet our electricity needs would, in the short term, increase our emissions rather than reducing them.
Uh-huh. And I guess that doesn't take into account also mining, milling, transporting uranium. There must be emissions associated with that as well.
Oh, no, that calculation does take into account the mining and milling and production of the nuclear fuel, in the same way as the calculations for solar or for wind turbines take into account producing the materials that are needed. What it doesn't take into account, though, is the emissions involved with decommissioning a large nuclear reactor and storing the fuel for geological time, because no one has yet done that, so we don't know what the emissions are, but they're certainly not zero.
So just back to my original question, how many nuclear reactors would we need to build in Australia to provide all our energy sources from nuclear?
Well, I mean, our power demand is about 30 gigawatts, so you would need something of the order of 30 nuclear reactors if you were going to run Australia totally from that source. And so you would have to find 30 sites where people were willing to have nuclear reactors.
Yeah.
And just to revisit that issue of social licence, at the time of the Switkowski report 20 years ago, the Australia Institute did a simple desktop study of what are the criteria for siting a nuclear power station. You need to be able to connect it to the grid. You need it to be near a load source. You need it to be on the coast to have enough cooling water and so on. And they published a short list of the possible sites. And the tsunami of panic among sitting members of Parliament had to be seen to be believed, as they all desperately raced out to assure their electorate that wherever a nuclear power station might be sited, it wasn't going to be in their electorate.
Yeah. Yep.
And that's a quite fundamental issue. I mean, since 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl and then Fukushima, no community is putting their hand up and saying, build a nuclear power station here. We're very happy to take that risk.
Yeah. So if nuclear energy is so much more expensive than renewables, can we build a nuclear industry in Australia without a price on carbon?
The short answer is no. The Switkowski report said we would need both a price on carbon and other forms of public subsidy to make nuclear power cost effective. And that's why no one in the electricity industry is supporting Peter Dutton saying that we should consider nuclear, because they can do takeaway sums and they can see that it's not cost effective. In fact, the demonstration of that is that in the Northern Hemisphere, old nuclear power stations that have amortised their capital cost are being closed down because just the costs of operation and maintenance make the electricity more expensive than you can get from new solar farms or new wind turbines. So it just does. So what the coalition is really saying is, if you're prepared to accept all of the problems with nuclear power, the risk, the need for military security to ensure fissile material is misused, the legacy of radioactive waste that needs to be managed for geological time. If you're prepared to accept all that, then you will be voting for the most expensive form of new electricity that there is anywhere in the world today.
So it's unlikely to put downward pressure on electricity prices then, by the sounds of it.
Totally unlikely. I mean, it's everywhere in the world. Nuclear power is subsidised, usually cross subsidies from the military production of radioactive material for weapons, or just explicit government subsidies. It's not cost effective compared with renewables. 10 years ago it was, but today it no longer is. And the only 3 nuclear power stations being built in Western Europe, to underline that point, are all years behind schedule and billions over budget.
Yeah, I understand that there's a new nuclear power station being built in Britain that's doubled in cost, and its cost is around about $90 billion.
That's right. And, the only reason nuclear power stations are still being built in countries like Britain is a government guarantee that they will be able to charge enough for the electricity for them to be cost effective. They can't compete just on strict economic grounds without significant government subsidy. So there either has to be a direct government subsidy or a willingness of consumers to pay more for their electricity, because the fundamental point is that it costs more. It's the most complicated way ever devised of boiling water, and it costs a lot more than other ways of boiling water, even if you think that's a good way to generate electricity, because the laws of thermodynamics mean that you throw away 2/3 of the energy in turning heat energy into electrical energy.
So what about the National Party in particular have talked about small modular reactors. Sounds pretty promising. What can you say about these small modular? I mean, it sounds like they get trucked in on the back of a truck and set up in a container, and away we go. All sounds very simple. What can you tell us about the modular reactors?
It sounds simple because it's complete nonsense. Firstly, there don't exist anywhere in the world yet small modular reactors. They're still a glint in nuclear technocrats' eyes. There was one project in the US that had a contractor, but it was cancelled when they realised what it was going to cost. And the so-called small modular reactors that are at the sort of on the drawing board stage aren't small in the sense of being, something you fit in a shipping container and deliver on the back of a truck. I mean, the prototype that Rolls-Royce is developing in Britain with large subsidies from the public purse is 470 megawatts. I mean, in Australian terms, that would be a large power station. And it's small by comparison with the large nuclear power stations, which are typically between 1,000 and 2,000 megawatts. But they're not small in any logical sense, consistent with what we're used to in Australia. And the second point about the so-called small modular reactors is the economics looks even worse than that of large reactors, because the reason nuclear power stations have become very large is that there really are economies of scale. It doesn't cost 4 times as much to build a 2,000 megawatt nuclear power station as it does to build a 500 megawatt one.
Mm-hmm.
So the nuclear power stations that have been built in the recent decades in the Northern Hemisphere have typically been between 1 and 2,000 megawatts, because that's less expensive than 400 or 500 megawatts.
Mm-hmm.
So there's 2 points. One is that you can't at the moment write a check and buy a small modular reactor. And secondly, if you could, they wouldn't be small in the Australian context, and they would be even more expensive electricity than large nuclear reactors. So they would either require huge public subsidies or, again, a willingness of us as consumers to pay much more for electricity than we would if it was coming from solar panels or wind turbines.
Yeah. The technology for these small reactors must exist, because that's how you power a nuclear submarine, I guess, in the military. Is that technology viable in the military?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's viable because in the military, expense is not an issue.
Uh-huh.
And you've seen the figures of how much it's likely to cost us to have a small number of nuclear submarines, something like $370 billion.
Yes.
For something like 8 or 10 nuclear submarines. And the point is that those small reactors that are developed for military use are very expensive, and they've been justified because traditionally most governments think when it comes to defence, money is not an issue. You pay what you think is needed to defend the country. But there's quite serious analysts like Professor Hugh White, who wrote the Defence White Paper in 2009, who think nuclear submarines aren't very good for our defence because they can't operate in the shallow water around our northern coastline. They're only useful for helping the Americans to threaten China. And if that's what we want to do in defence terms, they're a logical investment. But yes, you can build self-contained nuclear reactors that can be carried on submarines, but they're quite expensive. And the other issue about that is that they produce nastier and more intractable waste than nuclear power stations because of the enriched weapons-grade fuel that they use. Mm-hmm. And neither the US nor the UK, after 50 years of operation, have yet figured out how to manage the waste from nuclear submarines. Basically, the used reactors are still being stockpiled while they scratch their head and try to figure out what to do with it. Mm-hmm. And if we go down that path of using nuclear submarines, we will be taking on a task that so far no one in the world has solved, which is how do you responsibly manage the waste from those small nuclear reactors?
Yeah. So, in fact, you're saying the small modular reactors are going to provide even more expensive electricity than a large-scale nuclear reactor.
Yes, that's not just my view. I mean, CSIRO does an annual exercise called GenCost,
yes,
in which they look at the price of electricity from different technologies, and they've come to the conclusion that small modular reactors, if you could buy them, would produce even more expensive electricity than large reactors, which produce much more expensive electricity than solar or wind with enough storage to be what the industry calls firm capacity.
So, Ian, just one final question. You know, Peter Dutton's nailed his flag to the mast with nuclear here. Why do you think he's done that?
Well, I think it's all to do with the internal politics of the coalition. There are still elected members of parliament who don't really believe in climate change, who don't think we should be replacing coal with renewables. Now, if instead of replacing coal with renewables, you were going to replace coal with nuclear, it would take decades. So it would be prolonging the coal industry for decades. And I think that's really what this is all about. It's a cloak and dagger way of not closing down the old dirty coal-fired power stations by saying, we will replace them eventually with nuclear, which is lower emissions. And nuclear is lower emissions, but it's not a timely way to meet our needs to decarbonise the electricity supply.
And I guess if you want to do something quickly, it needs to be cheap and affordable. That's the quickest way to do something.
Absolutely, and the cheapest, most affordable, and quickest solution is renewables. I mean, you can build wind turbines or solar farms in months, whereas building nuclear power stations takes decades.
Ian, that's fantastic. Thank you very much for your time.
It's okay. Enjoyed talking to you, Matthew.
This is a debate that's not going to go away. In fact, I think it's going to become a hot topic leading up to the next election. I'd love to have another chat to you later in the year, perhaps.
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, it will be an election topic, and if I were a sitting member of the ALP, I'd be delighted to see the coalition rolling out the idea of nuclear power, because offering people the prospect that they can vote for more expensive and more dangerous technology doesn't look an election winner to me.
It seems like a big risk. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, we'll see how the debate pans out. Ian, thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure, Matthew.
And we'll talk again later in the year.
Sure. Okay. Anytime, mate.
Fantastic. Thank you.
All the best. Thanks. Bye.
See ya.